In the quiet hills of 6th century Italy, on a night meant for farewell, Saint Scholastica faced her brother Saint Benedict, knowing time was slipping away. And what followed was not argument or force, but a prayer that would bend the sky itself. Saint Benedict, disciplined and unwavering, had promised to return to his monastery before nightfall, believing order honored God. Yet Saint Scholastica sensed this meeting carried a final weight, a sacred urgency no rule could fully contain. As evening deepened, Saint Scholastica asked only for more time to speak of heaven, of souls, of eternity, yet Saint Benedict refused gently, bound by vows, unaware that heaven itself was already listening to her quiet, trusting heart. According to Saint Gregory the Great, Saint Scholastica lowered her head, folded her hands, and prayed, not with anger or demand, but with complete surrender. And in that moment, the still sky began to answer her faith. Thunder rolled, rain fell in sheets, and lightning split the darkness, transforming a peaceful night into chaos, as if creation itself insisted that Saint Benedict remain, silenced not by his sister's words, but by God's sudden command. Saint Benedict stood astonished, unable to leave, realizing that rules had yielded to love and discipline to mercy. While Saint Scholastica, calm and tearful, understood her prayer had been heard because it was rooted in charity. This was not rebellion against holiness, but its deepest expression, revealing that God sometimes honors love over structure, relationship over routine, and communion over schedule, especially when hearts seek eternity rather than comfort. Saint Gregory would later explain that Saint Scholastica loved more and therefore received more, reminding believers that prayer shaped by humility and longing can move not only hearts, but clouds, winds, and the will of heaven. That stormy night would become one of the Church's most tender lessons, teaching that obedience without love is incomplete, and that true holiness listens carefully when God speaks through unexpected voices, even through gentle tears. Before dawn arrived, Saint Benedict remained, and the hours shared with Saint Scholastica became their last on earth, sealing a moment where heaven paused time itself, proving that love, when pure, can hold even the night still. Saint Scholastica lived in 6th century Italy during a fragile era for the Church, choosing a consecrated life of prayer and spiritual devotion, mirroring the monastic vision of her brother Saint Benedict, while expressing holiness through tenderness rather than strict discipline. While Saint Benedict organized monastic life through structure and rule, Saint Scholastica embodied contemplative love, showing that feminine holiness in the early Church often flowed through intimacy with God, persistent prayer, and deep emotional surrender rather than visible authority. Their yearly meetings were rare and precious, occurring near Monte Cassino, where spiritual conversation replaced ordinary speech and time itself seemed sacred, as brother and sister spoke not of earthly matters, but of heaven, salvation, and the eternal soul. According to Saint Gregory the Great's dialogues, written decades later, this storm was no legend, but a theological lesson, preserved by the Church to reveal how God responds differently to love-filled prayer than to disciplined intention alone. Saint Gregory emphasized that Saint Scholastica's prayer was answered not because of emotional force, but because her desire aligned completely with God's will, illustrating that grace often flows where humility and charity meet in perfect harmony. The Church never questioned the authenticity of this event, preserving it within accepted hagiography, teaching believers that miracles may arrive quietly through nature itself, without spectacle, yet with unmistakable spiritual authority and lasting theological meaning. Saint Benedict himself recognized the lesson, admitting that his sister had prevailed because she loved more, a confession that reshaped monastic understanding, reminding the faithful that holiness is measured not only by obedience, but by the depth of love. Within early Christian tradition, Saint Scholastica's life affirmed that women shaped the Church not only through martyrdom or leadership, but through unseen spiritual influence, prayerful persistence, and a faith capable of reshaping the course of events. Her death followed shortly after that stormy night, reinforcing the Church's understanding that God had granted her final desire. Allowing one last communion of souls, sealed by prayer, love, and divine intervention, rather than prolonged earthly time. Through Saint Gregory's careful witness, the Church continues to present Saint Scholastica not merely as Benedict's sister, but as a spiritual teacher, reminding every generation that love-filled prayer can reach where discipline alone cannot. When dawn finally broke after that stormy night, Saint Scholastica was already nearing the end of her earthly journey, having poured out her final strength in prayer, leaving behind not noise or drama, but a silence filled with eternal peace. Saint Benedict later saw his sister's soul ascending to heaven, a quiet vision confirming that the storm was not resistance, but permission, granted by God to allow one final night of love before separation by death. For believers, this moment speaks gently yet powerfully, reminding hearts that God listens not to volume or authority, but to sincerity, and that prayers born of love often travel faster than rules shaped by fear. Saint Scholastica's miracle does not invite spectacle, but reflection, asking each soul whether love guides obedience or whether habit has replaced compassion, challenging believers to measure holiness by mercy rather than rigid perfection. In a world still torn between rules and relationship, her story whispers that heaven responds when hearts bend in humility, teaching that prayer aligned with love never returns empty, even when answers arrive through unexpected storms. Perhaps Saint Scholastica's greatest gift was not the storm itself, but the reminder that time spent in love is never wasted, and that God sometimes pauses the world so souls may say what eternity requires. As you listen to this story, consider the prayers you hesitate to speak, the love you postpone, and the moments you rush past, unaware that heaven may be waiting for your heart to ask sincerely. Saint Scholastica stands as a gentle witness that God is never distant from tender faith, encouraging believers to trust that even quiet prayers offered in tears can still shape nights, lives, and eternal destinies. If this story stirred something within you, let it rise as a prayer, not merely as admiration, allowing Saint Scholastica's witness to draw you closer to a God who listens when love speaks softly. And if your heart feels full at this moment, leave an amen in the comments, not as habit, but as agreement, joining generations of believers who trust that love-filled prayer still moves heaven today.